A vicious bully brutally slapped a 65-year-old disabled widow twice in a crowded diner, not knowing her son was a legendary mafia boss who lived by an ancient, ironclad code of vengeance. The entire room froze in terror, witnesses too afraid to breathe. The bully laughed, believing their fear made him untouchable. He had no idea he'd just committed an unforgivable sin, one that carried a death sentence in the world that operated in the shadows. Her son, Nicholas "Nick" Dalton, and his crew of tattooed enforcers were about to walk through that door for their daily visit. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story grips you, subscribe for more tales of justice. The air in Mid-Haven, New Jersey carried the weight of working-class dreams deferred. It was late autumn, and the quiet suburb wore its weariness like a badge. Cracked sidewalks lined with modest homes, corner bodegas with flickering neon signs, in the distant rumble of trucks on Route 9. The morning had brought a cold front, the kind that settled into bones and made old injuries ache. A thin frost still clung to car windshields even as the pale November sun struggled to warm the streets. The scent of diesel and coffee mixed in the air. This was the kind of place where people kept their heads down and their business to themselves. This was the fragile piece Patricia Dalton had carved out for herself. Patricia, a woman in her mid-60s with silver white hair pinned carefully back and eyes that had seen too much loss, moved slowly down Maple Street. Her cane clicked a steady rhythm on the pavement, a souvenir from the car accident that had taken her husband 3 years ago and left her with a permanent limp. She wore a simple gray coat over her floral dress, clothes that spoke of dignity maintained on a fixed income. She was a widow, a woman who had navigated decades of hardship with a quiet strength that others mistook for weakness. But beneath her tired exterior was a mother's fierce heart, one that had raised a son in these unforgiving streets. That son, Haman, Nicholas, had insisted she come to the Copper Kettle every morning, his way of keeping her safe, of giving her routine. He'd given her this small ritual, this moment of normalcy, even as his own world operated in darkness she preferred not to see. She pushed open the door of the Copper Kettle, a brass bell announcing her arrival with a cheerful jangle. The diner was Mid-Haven's unofficial living room, a relic from the 1970s with red vinyl booths patched with duct tape, a long formica counter, and the permanent aroma of burnt coffee, bacon grease, and yesterday's meatloaf. It was exactly the kind of place Patricia loved. Unpretentious, familiar, and warm despite its wear. Behind the counter, Maria Santos moved with the practiced efficiency of 20 years' service. Maria, a stout woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying temples, had grown up in Mid-Haven and knew every face, every secret, every dangerous current that ran beneath the surface. She offered Patricia her usual smile, genuine, but today tinged with something else, worry. "Morning, Mrs. Dalton. Your usual booth?" "Please, Maria," Patricia replied softly, her voice carrying the rasp of someone who'd learned to speak quietly in a loud world. As Patricia settled into her regular booth by the frost-etched window, she didn't notice the young man across the street. Marcus Chen, a local journalism student with dreams bigger than Mid-Haven, was setting up his camera on a tripod, hoping to capture authentic neighborhood life for his documentary project. He adjusted his lens, framing the diner's warm interior against the cold street. The perfect shot. Patricia's moment of quiet was obliterated by a voice that seemed to drain the warmth from the room. "Well, well, the famous Mrs. Dalton, still playing the helpless cripple routine?" The voice belonged to Bryce Wheeler. He was a slab of muscle gone to seed, mid-40s, with a shaved head, a jaw that looked like it had been broken more than once, and the dead eyes of a man who'd learned that violence paid. He wore a leather jacket over a stained t-shirt, his knuckles scarred and tattooed with crude symbols. He was a low-level enforcer, the kind of man who thrived on intimidating those weaker than himself. He'd been sitting in the corner booth with 2 other men, silent shadows who laughed when Bryce wanted them to. But now he was moving, his boots heavy on the checkered linoleum floor, and the diner's quiet morning chatter died like a candle snuffed out. Everyone knew Bryce Wheeler. Everyone knew what he did. Everyone knew to look away. He stopped at Patricia's table, his bulk casting a shadow over her frail frame. Behind the counter, Maria's hand trembled as she reached for the phone beneath the register. But she didn't call the police. Everyone knew they wouldn't come. Not for this, not against the people Bryce worked for. Instead, her fingers found her personal cell phone. She angled it carefully between the coffee maker and the napkin dispenser, making sure the camera captured Patricia's booth. She pressed record. This wasn't the first time she'd seen Bryce intimidate someone, but something about the cold calculation in his eyes today made her blood run cold. "I asked you a question, old woman," Bryce said, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. "You hard of hearing along with everything else?" Patricia looked up at him, her weathered hands steady on the table. "I hear you just fine, Mr. Wheeler," she said quietly. "But I don't have anything to say to you." Bryce's smile was a predator's leer. "Oh, I think you do. That property of yours by the lake, the one you're being so stubborn about. My employers are done asking nicely." Patricia's voice remained steady, though her hands had begun to tremble ever so slightly. "That property belonged to my husband's family for 40 years. It's not for sale. Not to you, not to anyone." The diner had gone absolutely silent. Even the coffee maker seemed to hold its breath. Marcus Chen, across the street, zoomed in instinctively, sensing something was about to happen. Maria's phone continued recording, her other hand gripping the counter's edge until her knuckles went white. Bryce leaned down, his face inches from Patricia's, his breath reeking of cigarettes and stale beer. "Listen to me very carefully, you stupid old cripple. This is your last chance. Sign the papers, take the money, and disappear. Or things get very, very unpleasant for you." "No." The word came out as barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of a lifetime of survival. "My answer is no." For a moment, Bryce just stared at her, his face reddening as if he couldn't quite process that this fragile woman had defied him. Then his hand moved, fast, brutal, without warning. The slap cracked across Patricia's face like a gunshot. Her head snapped to the side, her reading glasses flying off and skittering across the floor. A collective gasp rippled through the diner. But no one moved. No one dared. Patricia's hand went to her burning cheek, tears springing to her eyes, not from pain, but from the sheer shock of violation. She looked up at Bryce, disbelief written across her weathered face. You can't. I can do whatever I want," Bryce snarled. And then, as if to prove his point, as if to demonstrate that mercy had no place in his world, he struck her again. The second blow was harder, meaner, delivered with the full force of his rage. Patricia's head whipped violently to the side and her body followed, tumbling from the booth and crashing onto the cold linoleum floor. Her cane clattered away. She lay there, stunned, one hand pressed against her bleeding lip, her silver hair coming loose from its pins. The diner remained frozen in horrified silence. A young mother covered her child's eyes. An elderly man looked down at his coffee, shame burning in his chest. Maria's hand covered her mouth to stifle a sob. Bryce stood over Patricia's crumpled form, breathing hard, a sick smile spreading across his face. That's what happens when you don't listen. Outside, Marcus's camera captured everything, and somewhere in the frozen tableau of fear and helplessness, no one noticed the black Mercedes sedan pulling smoothly to the curb. The bell above the door didn't jingle this time. It merely whispered as the door swung open with controlled precision. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant. 3 men entered the copper kettle, and the fear that had gripped the diner transformed into something far more primal. This wasn't the fear of a local thug. This was the terror of prey realizing an apex predator had just entered the clearing. Nicholas Dalton moved like a shadow made flesh. He was tall and lean, dressed in a charcoal suit tailored so perfectly it looked like a second skin. His dark hair was slicked back, revealing a face carved from marble, sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes the color of frozen steel. Intricate tattoos crept up his neck, from beneath his crisp white collar, serpentine patterns that spoke of oaths sworn in blood. His hands, emerging from immaculate cuffs, bore rings on 3 fingers and more ink across his knuckles, symbols those in the know would recognize immediately. Behind him, 2 men in identical black suits flanked him like symmetrical extensions of death itself. Both wore sunglasses despite the overcast morning. Both had the coiled stillness of trained killers awaiting orders. Nick's gaze swept the diner in less than a second, cataloging every frozen face, every terrified witness. Then his eyes found what they were looking for, and the world narrowed to a single point of absolute focus. His mother, on the floor, blood on her lip, and a man standing over her. Nick didn't run. He didn't shout. He simply walked forward with the inevitability of a closing coffin lid, each step measured and purposeful. The crowd parted before him like water before the prow of a ship. Bryce Wheeler, still savoring his moment of dominance, turned at the sudden silence. His sneer faltered when he saw Nick approaching. Something ancient and instinctive screamed danger in the back of his brain, the recognition that he'd made a catastrophic mistake. "Who the hell?" Bryce began. He never finished the sentence. One of Nick's bodyguards moved with fluid speed, stepping between Bryce and Nick's path to his mother. The bodyguard said nothing, but his hand rested visibly on Bryce's chest, a gentle touch that carried the weight of an ultimatum. Bryce tried to push the hand away. It didn't move. He might as well have been pushing against a steel beam. Nick knelt beside his mother with a gentleness that seemed impossible from a man radiating such controlled violence. His hand touched her face with infinite care, turning it gently to examine the damage. When he saw the blood, the split lip, the red handprint blooming across her pale cheek, something behind his eyes went utterly, terrifyingly cold. "Ma," he said softly, his voice carrying the slightest trace of an accent smoothed by years of calculated refinement. "Who did this?" Patricia's trembling hand reached up to touch her son's face, a gesture she'd made 1,000 times when he was a boy coming home with scraped knees and black eyes from the neighborhood fights. "Nicky," she whispered, using the name no one else was permitted to speak. "I'm all right. Please don't." But Nick had already seen everything he needed to see. His eyes moved from his mother's injuries to the man being restrained by his bodyguard. He studied Bryce Wheeler the way a surgeon studies a tumor, clinically, dispassionately, already planning the excision. "Help her up," Nick said quietly to his second bodyguard, who moved immediately to assist Patricia with a gentleness that belied his imposing frame. The man steadied her with professional care, retrieving her cane, supporting her weight as if she were made of porcelain. Nick rose to his full height, brushing an invisible speck from his suit jacket. He approached Bryce with the unhurried confidence of a man who knew the outcome was already decided. The entire diner watched in paralyzed silence, afraid to breathe, afraid to miss a single moment of what was unfolding. "My name is Nicholas Dalton," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying to every corner of the room. "That woman is my mother." He paused, letting those words sink in like stones dropped into still water. "You put your hands on her." Twice. Bryce's bravado was crumbling, his face pale beneath the flush of exertion. "Listen, I didn't know. I was just doing my job." "Your job." Nick's repetition of the words was soft, almost curious. He glanced at his bodyguard and gave the slightest nod, nothing more than a fractional tilt of his head. What happened next was surgical in its precision. The bodyguard's movements were economical, practiced, devastating. Bryce's arm was twisted behind his back with such speed and control that he barely had time to gasp before his face was pressed firmly against the nearest table. No mess, no theatrics, just absolute, professional domination. Nick leaned down, his mouth close to Bryce's ear. "You're going to tell me who sent you. You're going to tell me every name, every detail, every single person involved in whatever scheme put you in this diner threatening my mother." His voice remained calm, almost conversational. "And you're going to do it right now because your window for cooperation is closing very, very quickly." Patricia, supported by the other bodyguard, felt something she hadn't experienced in the 3 years since her husband died. Complete, absolute safety. Her son, the boy she'd raised in these streets, had become something far more powerful than she'd ever imagined. And he had come for her. Bryce's resistance crumbled like wet paper. Words tumbled from his mouth. Names, addresses, amounts. The whole sordid web of corruption involving Councilman Paul Hendricks and a development company called Tristone Holdings. Nick listened without expression, committing every detail to memory with the precision of a man who'd built an empire on information. While Nick extracted his confession, his second bodyguard moved through the diner with quiet efficiency. He approached Maria behind the counter, and she instinctively stepped back, her phone still recording everything. The man extended his hand, not threatening, but absolutely firm. Maria understood. With trembling fingers, she handed over her phone. The bodyguard's thumb moved across the screen, transferring the video file, then deleting the original. Professional, thorough. He moved to Marcus Chen's position across the street next, visible through the window. The young journalism student saw him coming and actually considered running, but something about the man's purposeful stride told him running would only make things worse. The footage was copied, the original deleted. Marcus nodded shakily, understanding the unspoken message. This never happened. The bell above the door jingled, breaking the tension with its cheerful absurdity. Officer Danny Reeves stepped inside, his hand resting on his service weapon, his face already arranging itself into an expression of official concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. Danny was 32, perpetually 3 months behind on his mortgage, and supplemented his police salary with monthly envelopes from Tristone Holdings. He took in the scene, Patricia being tended to, Bryce pinned to the table. Nick Dalton standing in the center of it all like a dark star, everything orbited around. Danny's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. I got a call about a disturbance, Danny said, his voice cracking slightly. Everyone okay here? Nick turned slowly, his gaze settling on the officer with the weight of an executioner's axe. He didn't speak. He simply reached into his jacket. Danny's hand twitched toward his weapon and withdrew a slim leather wallet. He extracted a business card, pristine white with embossed lettering, and held it out. Danny approached on wooden legs and took the card. It was blank except for a phone number. No name, no title. Officer Reeves, Nick said softly, having clearly noted the nameplate. My mother slipped and fell. A terrible accident. You're going to file a report reflecting that. Nothing more. Nothing less. Danny's mouth opened, closed. His eyes darted to Bryce, still restrained, then back to Nick. There are witnesses, procedures. Nick took a single step closer. He didn't touch Danny, didn't raise his voice, but something in his eyes, something ancient and merciless, made Danny's blood turn to ice water. There was an accident, Nick repeated, each word falling like a stone into still water. Ask anyone here. They'll confirm it. Nick's gaze swept the diner, and every head nodded in silent, terrified agreement. The black Mercedes glided through Mid-Haven streets like a shark through dark water. Patricia seated in the back beside her son, an ice pack pressed gently to her swollen cheek. Nick hadn't spoken since they'd left the diner. But his jaw was set in a way Patricia recognized from his childhood, the quiet before calculated action. They passed through the working-class neighborhoods into an area where the houses grew larger, more secluded, until finally turning through wrought iron gates that opened automatically. The Dalton estate sat back from the road, a sprawling property that had once belonged to a shipping magnate. Now it served a different kind of empire. Inside, the house was a study in controlled elegance, dark wood, leather furniture, and original art that would make insurance companies nervous. But it was the basement level, accessible only by a private elevator, where the real work happened. Nick guided his mother to a comfortable chair in what appeared to be a sitting room, ensuring she was settled before pressing a discreet button on the wall. Within moments, a woman in her 60s appeared. Sophia, the estate's longtime housekeeper and the closest thing Patricia had to a friend in this world. She took over Patricia's care with gentle efficiency, bringing tea and a proper first aid kit. Nick descended another level where the atmosphere changed entirely. This was the war room. Sleek monitors lined one wall, a massive table dominated the center, and 3 men were already assembled, having been summoned by a single text message during the drive. Vincent Corso, Nick's consigliere, was a silver-haired man in his 50s with the sharp eyes of a former prosecutor who'd learned there were more effective forms of justice than courtrooms. He stood at the monitors, already reviewing the footage Nick's men had acquired. Beside him, 2 younger men, analysts, investigators. The machinery of a modern criminal organization worked their laptops with focused intensity. Bryce Wheeler, Vincent said without preamble, pulling up a digital dossier. Low-level muscle, Been on Tristone Holdings payroll for 8 months. Before that, collections work for various loan operations. 2 assault charges, both dismissed. Witnesses recanted. He paused meaningfully. Councilman Hendricks has been Tristone's pocket politician for 3 years. Zoning approvals, permit expediting, property tax assessments. The development they're planning would displace 47 families. Nick stood at the head of the table, his hands flat on its surface, studying the web of connections spreading across the screen like a cancer. Bank accounts, shell companies, property records, all of it laid bare by men who knew how to find what others tried to hide. "Bryce told you Hendricks gave the direct order?" Vincent asked. "He did." Nick's voice was quiet, final. "And he'll tell us again, properly this time. Recorded. Legally inadmissible, but useful." Vincent nodded, understanding immediately. "The property your mother owns, it's the keystone. Without it, their entire development collapses. They've tried buying out everyone on the lake. Then they chose poorly when they decided force was the answer." Nick's fingers drummed once on the table, the only outward sign of the fury burning beneath his composed exterior. Bryce Wheeler had precisely 4 hours of freedom after leaving the copper kettle. He'd spent those hours in mounting panic, making frantic phone calls that went unanswered, throwing clothes into a duffel bag, and draining what little cash he had from 3 different ATMs. By the time he reached the Greyhound station on the edge of town, his shirt was soaked with nervous sweat despite the November chill. He never made it to the ticket counter. The 2 men who intercepted him in the parking lot were professionals, not the bodyguards from the diner, but different operators, younger, harder. They moved with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this 100 times. One moment Bryce was walking toward the station entrance. The next his arm was twisted behind his back, and he was being guided with irresistible force toward a waiting van. The whole thing took less than 15 seconds. No one saw. No one would have helped if they had. The warehouse was exactly what every nightmare promised: isolated, soundproof, with harsh fluorescent lights that made everything look surgical and cold. Bryce was zip-tied to a metal chair bolted to the concrete floor. His bravado from the diner seemed like a memory from another lifetime. When Nick Dalton walked through the door, Bryce actually whimpered. Nick had changed from his suit into simpler clothes, dark jeans, a black shirt, his tattoos fully visible now in the harsh light. He carried a tablet computer and a small metal case. He set both on a nearby table with careful precision, then pulled up a chair and sat facing Bryce, close enough that their knees almost touched. "I'm going to ask you questions," Nick said conversationally. "You're going to answer them completely and truthfully. We're going to re-record everything. Do you understand?" Bryce nodded frantically, words tumbling out in a desperate cascade. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I didn't know she was your mother. I swear, Hendricks told me to pressure her. He said use whatever means necessary. He's the one. He's behind everything." Nick held up one hand and Bryce fell silent immediately. "Start from the beginning. Councilman Paul Hendricks. What is his relationship with Tristone Holdings?" The confession that followed was comprehensive, pathetic, and exactly what Nick needed. Bryce detailed every meeting, every payment, every property owner who'd been threatened or bought out. He gave up bank account numbers, described the offshore shell companies, named every corrupt official in Tristone's pocket. The tablet recorded everything, the camera capturing Bryce's tear-streaked, fur-streaked face as he betrayed everyone who'd ever employed him. When it was finished, Nick stood and picked up the metal case. "You put your hands on my mother," he said quietly. "There are rules about that, ancient rules." Bryce's eyes went wide with primal terror as he realized that cooperation had never been a path to mercy, only a necessary step before the inevitable. Nick walked toward the door, and 2 other men entered as he left. The heavy door closed behind him with a finality that echoed in the empty warehouse. What happened next occurred off-screen, in the darkness where justice and vengeance become indistinguishable. Vincent Corso had spent 3 decades learning that real power didn't come from guns or muscle. It came from knowing which financial threads to pull to unravel a man's entire life. He sat in the war room 72 hours after Bryce Wheeler's confession, orchestrating a symphony of destruction with the casual precision of a concert pianist. Tristone Holdings, where he said, pulling up a labyrinth of corporate structures on the main screen, is a house of cards built on leveraged debt. The parent company, Meridian Capital Group, has been using offshore accounts to hide losses for 2 years. They're one audit away from total collapse. Nick stood behind him, arms crossed, watching the financial architecture that had seemed so solid begin to crack under scrutiny. Show me. What followed was a masterclass in economic warfare. Vincent's team had spent the past 3 days infiltrating Tristone's digital infrastructure, not through hacking, but through carefully cultivated relationships with disgruntled employees, desperate accountants, and secretaries who'd been propositioned by their bosses one too many times. Money talked, and Nick had plenty of fiwed. The first domino fell when an anonymous package arrived at the Federal Trade Commission's Newark office. Inside was Bryce's recorded confession, along with 200 pages of meticulously documented financial crimes: wire fraud, money laundering, racketeering. The documents were admissible, properly sourced, and devastating. The second domino was more creative. Tristone's primary lender, Garden State Financial, received a disturbing report from their risk assessment division about irregularities in Tristone's accounts. The report was anonymous, but thorough enough to trigger an immediate loan review. When Garden State called in Tristone's outstanding debts, $47 million, the company had 72 hours to pay or face foreclosure on all their properties. They didn't have $47 million, not in liquid assets, not anymore. The third domino was personal. Councilman Paul Hendricks woke up to find his bank accounts frozen by federal order, his offshore holdings mysteriously leaked to a tenacious investigative journalist at the Newark Star-Ledger, and his political career effectively ended before his morning coffee had cooled. The FBI would be at his door by noon, but Nick's favorite move was the quietest. The lakefront properties that Tristone had already acquired through intimidation and coercion suddenly became available through a court-ordered asset seizure. A shell company, owned by a shell company, owned by another company that eventually traced back to the Dalton Family Trust, purchased them for pennies on the dollar. Patricia's property, the keystone they tried to take by force, now sat at the center of a protective ring of Dalton-controlled land. No developer would touch it. No bully would dare threaten her again. Vincent closed his laptop with a satisfied click. Tristone Holdings filed for bankruptcy this morning. Meridian Capital is facing a federal investigation. Hendricks will be indicted by Friday. Nick nodded once, his expression unchanged. And the properties? Being transferred to a community land trust. The 47 families they wanted to displace? They're buying their homes at below-market rates, courtesy of an anonymous benefactor. Officer Danny Reeves didn't show up for his shift on Thursday morning. His sergeant called his cell phone 17 times, each call going straight to voicemail. His apartment was empty, lease paid through the end of the month, but his clothes, his photos, his entire life, gone. His police cruiser was found parked neatly at the train station. Keys in the ignition, service weapon turned into the duty sergeant's desk with a typed resignation letter that cited personal reasons. No one looked for him very hard. No one wanted to know where he'd gone. Councilman Hendricks lasted slightly longer, 3 more days until the federal indictment hit the morning news. By evening, his attorney had negotiated a plea deal that would see him in minimum security for the next 7 to 10 years. His wife filed for divorce. His name became synonymous with corruption in local politics. He would serve as a cautionary tale. His fall meteoric and complete. But it was Bryce Wheeler's absence that spoke loudest to those who understood the language of the streets. He simply ceased to exist. No body was found. None ever would be, but everyone knew. The whispers spread through Midhaven like frost creeping across a window. He touched the capo's mother. Those 5 words carried the weight of an execution notice. Have you ever wondered what real justice looks like when the system fails? When the corrupt protect each other and the vulnerable have no one? Drop a comment below and tell us where you stand. Maria Santos found an envelope at the Copper Kettle 3 days after the incident. Inside was a cashier's check for $250,000 in a simple typewritten note. For renovations, for your silence, for your loyalty to those who cannot protect themselves. There was no signature, but Maria understood perfectly. She paid off the diner's mortgage that afternoon, replaced the ancient equipment, and hired her niece who'd been struggling to find work. She never spoke of what she'd witnessed, but sometimes when the morning sun hit the window just right, she'd look at Patricia Dalton's usual booth and feel a complicated mixture of gratitude and fear. The message to Midhaven was clear and absolute. Patricia Dalton was untouchable. Her property was sacred ground, and anyone who failed to understand this would learn the same lesson Bryce Wheeler had learned, in the same permanent fashion. If you believe people who prey on disabled widows deserve exactly what Bryce got, hit that subscribe button. Only those who side with bullies and cowards won't. The streets had a new order now, enforced not by badges and laws, but by something far older and far more certain. The ironclad code of family, backed by the kind of power that didn't need to announce itself. The town accepted this reality with the quiet resignation of people who understood that sometimes protection comes with sharp edges and safety has a shadow price. 2 weeks after the incident, Patricia Dalton walked into the Copper Kettle at her usual time, her cane tapping its familiar rhythm on the sidewalk. The bruises on her face had faded to yellow-green shadows, nearly concealed by careful makeup. Her silver hair was pinned back in its customary bun, and she wore a new coat, charcoal wool, expensive, a gift from her son that she'd initially protested before accepting with quiet grace. The bell above the door announced her arrival, and the effect was immediate. Conversations didn't just pause, they stopped completely. Every head turned. The young mother who had covered her child's eyes during the assault stood immediately, offering Patricia her booth. The elderly man who'd stared into his coffee in shame rushed to hold the door. Maria Santos came from behind the counter, her eyes bright with emotion, and guided Patricia to her usual seat as if she were visiting royalty. "Your usual, Mrs. Dalton?" Maria asked, her voice carrying a reverence that hadn't been there before. "Please, Maria, and stop fussing. I'm fine." But Maria did fuss, bringing Patricia the freshest coffee, the warmest pastry, refusing payment with a firmness that allowed no argument. This was the new reality of Patricia's life, profound, almost uncomfortable respect from a community that had watched her son rewrite the rules of power in their small corner of the world. Let me ask you something. Do you think Patricia's son did the right thing? Should families have the power to protect their own when the system fails them? Comment below with your honest thoughts. Through the window, the lakefront property was visible in the distance, the morning sun glinting off the water. The for sale signs that had plagued the neighboring lots were gone now, replaced by families who'd been given second chances, homes they could actually afford, a future that didn't involve displacement. Patricia's own property, her husband's legacy, sat at the center of it all, protected not by lawyers or police, but by something far more absolute. At exactly 9:30, the black Mercedes pulled up to the curb. Nick Dalton emerged, flanked as always by his bodyguards, their presence transforming the cheerful morning street into something darker, more primal. He entered the diner and the temperature seemed to drop. His eyes found his mother immediately, scanning her face with a tenderness reserved only for her, checking for any lingering pain or fear. "Ma," he said softly, sliding into the booth across from her. "Nikki, you didn't have to come." "Yes, I did. It wasn't negotiable. It never would be. This daily ritual, his presence, his protection, was as certain as the sunrise." They sat together, mother and son, drinking coffee and sharing the companionable silence of people who'd survived together. Around them, the diner remained hushed, respectful, understanding that they were witnessing something sacred and dangerous in equal measure. If you can't stand people like Bryce Wheeler who think they can hurt the defenseless without consequences, smash that like button right now. Comment "Justice for Patricia" if you believe everyone deserves protection, and hit subscribe because we're bringing you more stories of real justice. Only those who side with bullies and corrupt systems won't engage. Outside, Marcus Chen walked past with his camera, heading somewhere else to film his documentary. He'd learned his lesson about capturing certain moments. Some stories were better left in the shadows where they belonged. Patricia reached across the table and squeezed her son's tattooed hand. "Thank you," she whispered. Nick's expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened gently around hers. "Always, Ma. Always." The lakefront property would remain in the Dalton family forever, protected not by deeds or titles, but by the dark, absolute promise of a son who'd proven that some lines could never be crossed without devastating consequences. Midhaven had learned its lesson, and the town would not forget. Peace had returned, cold, enforced, and eternal. If this story moved you, if you believe in protecting those who cannot protect themselves, then subscribe right now because tomorrow's story is even more intense. Don't miss it. Hit that subscribe button if you stand against injustice. Only those who side with the corrupt and the cruel will scroll past.